Hi, and welcome to the Build Peace Dialogue. I'm really sorry that we've had a couple of minutes of delay to get started. We had some technical issues while we figured out how to get the dialogue started. Right now I'm showing that we have 0 viewers here for the application to catch up, and hopefully we'll see some of you getting on in a couple minutes, and then we'll get started.
Fantastic. So as I understood, the plan was we would each talk for a few minutes and then go to a dialogue and questions.
That is the plan, yes.
All right.
So, I'm going to wait another minute until I'm in Germany, so it's 6:10 here.
Mm-hmm.
And then I will start with an introduction about the dialogue series, and I'll introduce each of you, and
Mm-hmm.
then we'll get started. And Jonathan, I understand you have some slides,
Yeah, I made a few pictures.
and yeah, we can show those. And then Jira?
No, I'll just talk through the main talking points.
Okay, great.
Mhm.
So we'll wait another minute.
I'm gonna retweet it.
Thanks. I'm also going to post in the event page that if people are trying to watch it, they should reload the page because sometimes it requires that to get the video going. Okay, I think it's time to get started. So thanks for your patience. I'm sorry we're a couple minutes late. Welcome if you're joining us for this Build Peace dialogue. We'll be on this dialogue for an hour, including some time to ask questions. So feel free to submit questions when you think of them, and you can even start doing that now. There's a green button at the bottom of the screen where you can ask a question. So this is the third dialogue in the Build Peace dialogue series. The previous dialogues are available on YouTube. Build Peace conference about peace building at the intersection of technology, arts, and research. We've held 2 conferences, one in Boston and one in Nicosia in Cyprus. We're hosting our 3rd conference at ETH Zurich from the 9th to the 11th of September, and tickets are available at our website, buildpeace.org. The main theme of the conference is transform. Our sub-themes look at political and socio-cultural transformation and ethical questions around transformation and the interaction of technology, arts, and research in the peace-building process. And this series, is the Build Peace Dialogues, bring together 2 speakers from different fields to answer the same question in conversation with each other. Today, we bring Nanjira Sambuli and Jonathan Stray. They'll be discussing the question live at the Build Peace conference in September as well. And what we've asked them to talk about is one of the central topics of the conference, which is what can peace builders in the global north and global south learn from each other about the ethics of peace tech. Nanjira, I'm going to introduce the speakers and then we'll get into their presentations first. Nanjira is currently the head of research at iHub, where she's been overseeing tech reach in East Africa. She's worked with a number of initiatives in new media, including Sandstorm Kenya, UN Habitat, and UNEP. She's also worked on a bunch of awareness initiatives, including the Africa, I'm sorry, I don't actually know how to pronounce this, Mazlando Ion Kenya Parliament, Kenya, February 28th, Africans Act for Africa, among others. She's also edited an essay collection entitled Innovative Africa, The New Face of Africa, and has contributed to a number of media publications. She sits on the advisory board of some of She's a board member at the Media Policy Research Center, and she's a member of the Networked News Lab. She also dabbles in music. Jonathan Stray is a data scientist and a journalist. He teaches computational journalism at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University. He's a freelance journalist and a computer scientist. He's written for the New York Times, Associated Press, Foreign Policy, ProPublica, and Wired. He currently leads the development of Overview, the open source document set analysis system for investigative journalists. He teaches a course in computational journalism at Columbia University. He's also reported from Hong Kong, Berlin, and San Francisco and designs a parallel programming language for Adobe systems, or has designed a parallel programming language for Adobe systems. He also has built music-playing interactive fire sculptures and trains in focus art of aerial rope. So now we're going to begin with a short presentation from Nanjira, if you're ready to present what you think as a peace builder is important for peace builders in the global north to know about ethics coming out as a peace builder working in the global south.
Sure. Thank you for having me. And jumping right into it, I think I'll talk through 4 key things that come to mind so far as the question at hand is. And first and foremost is the ethics of intervention, in the sense that you as the actor trying to intervene in this case, are you the right person to step in? Are you aware of the context you're trying to step into? As much as tech and tech platforms have helped us connect and give us a sense of understanding and I guess cursory knowledge about a context, do you really know, or do you even know the people who you could work with in those contexts to help with the intervention? This do-gooder mentality in the case of peaceTech is great, but also needs to be very appropriate. And so that's a very particular important question. Sometimes, and even before the conflict, in the event of a conflict or before that, whom do you need to know if you're genuinely interested in deploying peace tech solutions in a certain context? It should not just be about the reaction at that moment, but also we should have plans in place to help us figure out whom in that area do we need to have mobilized or to be in communication with, so that in the event of a conflict, you're able to work with people who were legitimate actors in that ecosystem and who will also act ethically. That leads me to the second thing, which is appropriateness of technology. So once we've determined whether you're the appropriate actor in this space, is the technology you're about to deploy appropriate? If you're going to deploy an app, how many people actually have access to affordable bundles or internet services that help them leverage that app? If maybe they may have mobile phones in their hands, but SMS systems are easier to use, and therefore if you have an app and people cannot afford to use it, your do-good intentions are compromised because the technology was not appropriate. And so far as also the appropriateness element goes, and tying it back to the first point, there's a role of different actors and what their role should be. So you have everyone from donors to private sector to technologists on the ground and technologists remotely, and what they want to help when a conflict arises. In a previous engagement on something similar, one thing that was interesting to come up is also private sector are always left out in this case, and they would want to help. And I remember somebody asking me, so what role can private sector play in peace tech, in the initial and continual development of solutions? And especially if you're talking about local private sector actors in this conflict zones, if you will, or emerging areas of conflict, what role can they play? They should be an important stakeholder to engage. For instance, telecommunication companies would be a wonderful asset to bring on board in the peace tech space, because in the event of a conflict, they're the first person you can reach out to and say, subsidize the cost of bulk SMS, for instance, because this is a conflict situation. So having that somebody who's a legitimate player to help link those make those linkages in sectors is very important. And also with the role of donors in this case, in the general peace tech space and to really help with furthering the conversation about ethics. I think donors have a key role to play in, in knowledge management because they can synthesize insights that have come in from other spaces where they've supported work on the ground. And so we need to have knowledge repositories of the peace tech industry, as nascent as it is, that help us understand what has worked in a certain context, what has not worked, what are the lessons learned, and how can we deploy them to minimize not getting the job done before in a conflict arising zone, because we're trying to mobilize everything from the ground up. And so that's, I think, a very important thing to consider as we go forward. And in this case, I'm obviously looking at it in the sense that most conflicts, as we talk about them in peace tech, happen in the global south, and a lot of the actors and the people who can mobilize sometimes tend to be in the global north. And so within that setup is what I'm phasing all this around. Now, once we have the tech in place and the legitimacy aspects in it, there's always the point about data insofar as tech is being leveraged. So, do the people from whom data will be generated in a conflict setup or in a, let's just continue the conflict zone as just one example. There are obviously many other incidents in the peace tech space, but if it's in the event of a conflict and data is being collected, do the people from whom this data is being collected have they given informed consent? Are they aware of what that data is being used for? Is their privacy going to be guaranteed, their security too, by leveraging the technologies we're building? I think in peace tech it's a high time we were very clear about saying that the interventions we design must have privacy by design and must uphold the security of users. I think that would be a very important manifesto. Of course, that is going to be challenged if in the event of such, it's people leveraging other platforms that exist, and that's another factor we need to think of. We may build the technology, but if the people are elsewhere, if people are on Facebook and that's where they're going to leverage and organize to make sure that if in the event of a conflict they're reporting back to their friends and their family to say that they're safe, then what do we do in that case? How are we going to try and pull people out of the social media platforms and move them to our platforms? These are some of the questions we need to think through. And how do we make sure that these principles that we abide by in peace tech are leveraged insofar, regardless of what technology or platform is being leveraged? And then finally, I'd say with all the data, there's also the data sharing component and the complications of that. There's going to be data that's generated. Maybe various actors are involved in generating the data or collecting data, but how can we all work in a particular conflict area to make sure that data works for the good of that society and helping in mitigate whatever conflicts are arising and towards peace building in general? And even outside of a conflict situation, for as long as there are roles to be played, how do you make sure that the data that is collected is shared back in a way that is meaningful, useful, but also protecting the people who generated that information, and there's a privacy element. And so I think those are the 4 key things for me that I'm looking at, and I'm looking forward to engaging further on what we can do about that. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Nanjira.
Are we on our own now? Oh, there it is.
No.
Great.
Thank you so much. And for those of you who have just joined us, this is the third Build Peace Dialogue, and we're talking about how can peace builders in the global north and the global south learn from each other about ethics. And we are joined by Nanjira, sorry, I have brain block, Nanjira Sambuli and Jonathan Stray. And Nanjira just spoke about perspective as a peace builder working in the global south, and Jonathan is going to speak with us about his perspective coming from the global north. So Jonathan.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, it's funny that the theme is what can we learn from each other, because I'm going to end up talking about some similar things. But I might be able to offer a particular perspective, and I made a couple slides, so I'm gonna try to show them here. So now you're probably seeing yourself. All right, you see some slides? Yeah.
Yes.
You guys see that? Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk a lot about collecting conflict data, right? And just to start with, why are we doing this? Because we want to see what's happening. We want to try to predict the future, and then we want to learn from what we're doing. And so this is sort of really, I've been working as a data journalist, and this is really the reasons that people use data. And it's something that has been really developed to a high degree in the North. So I want to talk about that a little bit. This is from a UN document on data and peacekeeping operations. And it's kind of old-fashioned, right? Like it's very sort of militarized, and airplanes and sensors and checkpoints and stuff. And I think we're sort of moving past the era where this is what data looks like in a conflict zone. And for a few years now, we've seen things like this. There's this whole crisis mapping community that I suspect our viewers are familiar with. This is just one example where the UN OCHA actually asked the Standby Task Force, which is a volunteer group, to track violent incidents during the Libya crisis. And then there's all kinds of other data that we're starting to look at. This is work by Erica Chenoweth, who wrote a fantastic book called Why Civil Resistance Works. And what she looked at, she and colleagues, was how often do non-violent political campaigns succeed as compared to violent ones. And so she compiled a list of every non-violent resistance movement in the 20th and 21st centuries and found that non-violent succeeded about twice as much. And one of the things that she showed was this relationship between the percentage of the people who participated in a movement and the likelihood of success. And she showed that by the time you get 3% of citizens participating in a movement, which doesn't seem like a lot, you have like an 80% chance of overthrowing regime or seceding and so forth. And so I think we need to study not just conflict but peace. And then another sort of aspect to this that is starting to be very intensely developed is how do we know it works, right? So Nanjira talked about knowledge bases and not learning everything from the ground up. But there's a fundamental problem there, which is that every peace building situation is kind of unique. It's so contextual and so historical that it's not clear how we learn from one situation and apply it to the next. And I've contrasted this with medicine, where if you're trying a drug or a surgery, you can split people into treatment and control groups. Well, you can't really choose not to do anything in a conflict situation just because you want to learn something, right? That doesn't seem ethical to me. If there is a case for intervention, there's a case for intervention, regardless of what you can learn from it. So this is challenging, and it requires different data approaches. And so one of the things that people have been looking at more seriously is the idea of data exhaust and microdata, right? So all of our daily lives, text messages and websites you visit and purchases and posts and even your location, all of the data, even in the global south, where we think of it as much less sort of technologically enabled, but you have a phone there, and so your location is still being recorded by the phone companies continuously. This stuff is being exploited for commercial use, but it is not currently being exploited for humanitarian use. And there's various reasons for that. Part of it is just the private sector is reluctant. But part of it is that there are really, as you might imagine, very severe ethical problems with trying to use this level of granularity in your data. So this was from some work done a couple years ago, where the New York Taxi Commission released anonymized data for all the taxi rides over a couple years in response to a Freedom of Information request. And it's anonymized, right? So it shouldn't tell you who's going where, except that a researcher was able to look for pictures of celebrities getting in and out of taxis and figure out their trips. So anonymization is not so anonymous when you start combining it with other data sets. And so there are all of these sort of privacy and security and harm and dignity issues that come with using data at this level. Now, of course, I'm hardly the first person to say this. I want to give a shout out to the Responsible Data Forum, which is a group that has produced a wonderful set of guidelines for using data responsibly in development projects. And so here's one of their slides. And it was interesting that Nanjira mentioned consent, because that's also the slide that I've chosen. And here it's just talking about you can't really perfectly anonymize a data set. And so they have a series of best practices. And so I think this is really something which is developing rather rapidly in the North, which is both the use of much more detailed data sets to try to get insight into this very tricky problem of what works, and the use of best practices and ethics around that. And so this is where I hope this is all going. So I've, there's a sort of evidence-based medicine movement in the global North, which is kind of funny, right? Don't we hope that all evidence or all medicine is based on evidence? But the answer is actually not. But it would be nice if we could get conflict resolution on an evidence-based footing. But as soon as you do that, you have all of these complicated questions about privacy and security. And in a conflict zone, there are real harms to potential data breaches. And if I know your location, I can shell you. And this is not theoretical. This happened in the Syrian conflict. So you can't just plot people's location on a map. And then there's the question of, if you are collecting all this data and you're releasing any of it, are you interfering with the peace process? And there is a problem of doing no harm, because you can actually make things worse. So that's sort of where I see the global North as contributing, and some of the ethics that we're attempting to build up around that.
Thanks. I thought that was really, really interesting. And we have questions coming in from the audience. But I'm going to ask a question first that came up recently for me. And this is for Nanjira. As both of you have been talking, I've been thinking data is so essential in the process of understanding if we're doing what we need to do properly. And so my question is, if we're going to collect it, and if we're going to collect it well and in a non-extractive way and in a safe way, are there some best practices that you'd be able to articulate? And then Jonathan, I'll turn that after Nanjira has some, I'll turn it over to you if you've got some extras to add there.
Yeah, I think Jonathan was right in mentioning Responsible Data Forum, and I really acknowledge and appreciate the work they've been doing, and they've been doing excellent work with also bridging these gaps between Global North and Global South best practices, and bringing all these people who are working on data to have some convenings around that. So what they've been producing as best practices, there, I definitely recommend to look into. But just to articulate them better, I think there's also, you have to ask yourself the question that is data the only way to actually make something happen? And how are we conceptualizing data in this case? Is it something that is generated through technology? Is it listening to voices of people wherever they already may be talking, or we're trying to bring them to another platform, as I was mentioning earlier, to give us data? And so even how we conceptualize data in this element is very, very critical to help inform what are these best practices. But again, do no harm. I mean, whatever it is that you do with this data, I think do no harm is one of those hackneyed phrases, but something that's particularly important in this case, because in trying to build peace, we must minimize as much tension and further conflict as possible. And so with whatever data we may be trying to collect, we have to be very conscious at every step of the way. Who are we trusting to help collect the data? Are we speaking to the right people on the ground if it's speaking to them to generate this data? Are you looking for a representative sample of insights? Obviously, as much as crowdsourcing is an excellent way to collect data, what if there are voices that are not being heard and we're relying only on the data that is generated that way? So there are all these other factors that also tie to traditional research best practices, or good practices really, that need to be factored in. And I think, again, it's exactly what Jonathan said. As much as there are good practices, I think somebody told me the other day, we should be conscious of talking about best practices. It's the superlative that makes it sound like we never again from there. But good practices, as much as there are some that come up over time, we have to be still very cognizant of the uniqueness of every conflict or every situation. And so I think all those are the good practices to have in mind. It's really just being very careful and not reducing. I think that the last thing I'd say is not reducing people to data points in this case. Let us not minimize people to mere data points because we're interested in collecting data. I've found this is a bit of a cautionary tale that must be re-articulated over and over again, because with this excitement to collect data, big data, small data, this, that, or whatever other phrase or adjective for data, people are being removed from the context. And in this case, we're talking about people who need something as critical as peace to be there, whether it's in a conflict setup or a continuing conflict zone. So we must remember to humanize these data points and remember that these are people we're talking about. And I think that's the ultimate good practice I'd articulate in this time.
Cool. And Jonathan, do you have anything further to add to it?
The question was, where are we looking for a report? Pointers, like where can we refer to? Yeah. I mean, the Responsible Data Forum is doing a lot of really interesting work right now, and they have a really nice handbook that I want to refer to. But you know, it's sort of a rabbit hole once you start going down this issue of privacy and security, and there's it appears in every field, and I think one of the most powerful things that you can do is try to import good ideas from other fields. So, for example, how are people dealing with health data? You know, health data is very sensitive, and we have you know, a lot of experience and legal frameworks and ethical frameworks for how we share and who we share with and how we store it and how we anonymize it. And people do research studies on health data all the time. So what are the protocols that have been developed for that, and can we use them in peace building? It's really, it's my favorite trick is to mine good ideas from other fields, and everybody uses data.
Great. Okay, thanks for that. I thought it was really relevant. I think we can go to a question from the audience. Selecting question, please wait. Okay, current question from Bruno Sequeira, who was one of our previous dialogue speakers. Nanjira, with your experience working on the ground, what do you think are the biggest mistakes with applying the use of technology in sensitive areas that might be recurring in different projects and scenarios?
Very good question. I think first and foremost, it's just the appropriateness of the technology used. If I've found, or what I've seen so far, is people want to intervene with technologies that have an internet component to it. But if the people, especially that are being afflicted, are not anywhere near an internet access point, that means that there's a big gap. And that seems to be a recurring thing, because I guess that's where we're going with technology. Apps, virtual reality is about to come up. And so somebody soon will come to the ground with VR, VR peaceTech, but is it appropriate on the ground? And I think it's also informed by the fact that most peaceTech work has happened at the time of conflict, so it's really mobilizing the resources people are familiar with. But I think we're learning now that that's something we need to be very keen about. And I understand that on the other end of it, with people who've tried to use the appropriate technology, say SMS technology, because you've not interacted with telecommunication companies before, by the time you're able to lobby them to maybe subsidize the cost of using, say, bulk SMS features, it's sometimes too little too late. And so sometimes it's not being very keen with the key relationships that should be built across the spectrum to help activate as and when peaceTech work needs to happen, or peace building, conflict resolution needs to happen. And so these are some of the two key things that I've realized. We still keep going back and forth around them. And over time, what that means is it also delays the activation of such a machinery. The key relationships that need to be in place, they should not just, a conflict situation should be what helps make sure that those relationships exist. But it's really difficult if you're only trying to build them at that particular point, because that complicates efforts, and this is at the cost of people's lives and well-being. And so I think those are the two key things: the appropriateness of technology and the key requisite relationships to help people work together towards mitigating a conflict situation as it arises. And even outside of conflict situations, if I may say so, generally peace tech workouts in the broader spectrum.
I'd like to follow up on that a little bit, because you mentioned about the appropriateness of technologies, but also being keen about the relationships that you build. What would you do? So if there's a situation where a conflict has broken out suddenly and your organization wants to move in, but you haven't managed to build these relationships yet, and you are looking to, say, you have a proof of concept or that you want to deploy, but you don't have a relationship with the telecom yet, how would you go about approaching the communities and the organizations in that case?
It's a very interesting question, because if you want to prove, like, it's a proof of concept situation that you want to test out in a conflict zone, that whole framing could be very tricky. I'd say if you have something that you want people to use, reach out. There's always somebody who's been on the ground. One thing I've learned is people are not as helpless as we think, and especially in the global south. There are people who will respond. The question is, how can you get to them, and how can you get to them quickest? Because citizens will always react to something that helps them, and they will try and help themselves outside of the help that comes from outside. And so if you cannot make those linkages, maybe you should not step in. That would be my thinking around it. If you want to have your technology tried out, build those requisite relationships to really make sure it's appropriate, to make sure that, I mean, at that point, if you're not able to pick the phone or reach to the people who are being, impacted, and to get them to use the technology, I think that's probably not the time to try and do that. Because if you're coming at it as, oh, perfect opportunity to deploy my tech and forgetting the people, then I think that's a very wrong way to come at it. Just my thinking.
Yeah. And Jonathan, I think it would be interesting to know what you see coming from your perspective as big mistakes that are used in applying the technology, because a lot of conversations about moving in from the global north to the global south happen in the global north before people even get to the global south. So in those conversations, what would you say are big mistakes that come up, and how can people avoid them?
Well, a friend of mine on Google had a wonderful phrase. He said, machine learning is a mind virus. And what he meant by that was it's this thing that people reach for and they talk about as transformative, and and machine learning and related artificial intelligence techniques are very interesting. But after spending a while trying to apply technology for social uses, I've really seen the most gain with very simple things. So in terms of data analysis, I would start with counting. Counting would be good. One of the main problems I see is not that people need a data scientist to come in and analyze their data, but that they've never bothered to collect the things that they might want to worry about. So for example, I've been working with people who are in debt and they're negotiating with creditors, and the financial counseling services were not tracking the prices that they eventually got for their clients when they're trying to negotiate repayments, and so getting much worse prices. So the technologists want to apply interesting technical tools, but often very simple tools get you 90% of the gain. And then, after you've done the simple thing, you look at what the deficiencies are, and that tells you what the complex thing you need to do is.
All right. Just to remind people who have tuned in while we've been going, this is the third Build Peace Dialogue in preparation for the Build Peace Conference, which is happening at ETH Zurich from the 9th to the 11th in September. And we are talking about what peace builders in the global north and the global south can learn from each other about ethics. And if you have a question, please feel free to ask in the bottom corner of your screen, there should be a green button that says Ask a Question. And so I'm wondering if either of you have any thoughts that have come up through this conversation that you want to share. And if you don't, I have another question that I can ask. All right.
Yeah, let's do the question. Yeah.
All right. This one is about consent, because recently we had the Build Peace Fellows come in, and we were talking about gathering data on the ground in various places. And the question is informed consent. And what is the bar that you need to cross for informed consent? If you're going into a place where the people who you're interacting with have very little internet access or very low literacy levels, how and say you're making a video with them or something, and you tell them, well, we're putting it on YouTube. How do you get across to people what that actually means in a context that they can understand if they've never interacted with YouTube and don't know the cultural implications of it?
I want to jump in there real quick. I'll go back to the point I made earlier. One, people are not as helpless as they tend to frame them to be, especially in the global south setting. Sure, they may not be familiar with YouTube as a platform, but they are familiar with the fact that probably people have been there before to try and research them. And so it's really about how you phrase whatever it is you're trying to do, what the implications of that are, where that will end up. It's not that you have to adopt certain Google Gaga language to dumb it down for them. It's really about what are you trying to convey and what are the steps along the way that will have implications. It's simply the same way. The same way you do it, say, in rural Michigan is the same way you'll do it in rural Kenya. You may find people on both sides who don't know what YouTube is, but you're collecting, you're trying to film them. That means that their faces are going to be seen somewhere. It could be something that's bigger than TV. You could phrase it like that, something that's continuous TV, if you want to call it that. It means that whether you'll use their names, you need to let them know whether you'll use their names, whether you'll mention their village, whether you'll, what else will be portrayed in that output, and have their sense of whether that's okay with them. I think it's the same way you'd explain. So I'd be careful not to make it sound like it's a unique thing for people in the global south, but it's really about informed consent as a business. Even myself today, if I'm signing up on Facebook's terms and conditions, I don't understand legalese. But what's the informed consent if they want to use my data to place ads around it? I think that's how I'd think about it. I think if you want to communicate something, you will find a way to communicate it honestly and truly. I think the issue of consent is people want to minimize all the little loopholes they have to go through to get permission to do what they want to do. Yeah, just an initial thought.
Cool. Jonathan, do you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, I'm going to defer to Nanjira because I think that my first thought was, wow, actually that's a really hard problem. I barely feel like I understand the cultural implications of YouTube myself. I'm not sure how I would explain them to someone who'd never seen it. Yeah, I don't know that I have anything to add to what you said.
Great. Well, we don't have any other questions coming in at the moment, and I guess my last thought is about the role of the private sector as an important stakeholder, and this is something that has come up recently in other conversations about peace-building policy in the EU and such, where currently lots of governments don't necessarily see private industry and the private sector as a group, as a co-collaborator in peace-building efforts. So if you had any advice for how to conceptualize the private sector in a way that, like, when you move into an area, who should you be looking for in terms of business owners? Because sometimes businesses can, and the way that they work with people can be contributing to a conflict situation if they're taking advantage of displaced labor and such. So is there any sort of guidelines that you'd have for anyone who's thinking about working with private sector and what they should look for and how to have those conversations?
I can go. Oh, Jonathan, go ahead. Go ahead, please.
Well, so there's a strand of work here which goes under the name of data philanthropy. which has been largely the work of the folks at UN Global Pulse. And I think this is a very interesting framing. It's a framing that allows the private sector to understand the idea of donating data as a humanitarian or a philanthropic action. And so that's sort of one way in. And of course, they're going to take credit for that. They're going to have marketing campaigns about how great they are and so forth. But that leads me to the next point that I would say, which is that you are going to be working with people with whom you are not necessarily ideologically or politically aligned. That's just the reality of it if you're going to enter this space. And so there's a whole set of complicated trade-offs there. And I don't know that I have too much to good advice to give, other than don't expect them to see the world the way that you see it, but also they're people. Don't expect that they're evil because their primary interest is running a business. So you're going to, like any agreement, it's going to have to be about alignment of interests and mutual respects. And I think the private sector does have an interest in conflict resolution. I mean, of course they have an interest in conflict resolution. They need political stability for economic operation. And so I think there are opportunities there, but they will be looking out for your interest, and you have to understand what their interest is.
Yeah, I couldn't say it any better. It's absolutely that. And just thinking about peacetech in this as a later entrant to the market, as something that's not coming into a vacuum. There have been relationships that have been established. This is not just about peacetech as an event, but peacetech as a process. So that if, again, the underlying factor is without peace, none of us are doing anything, because that's the underlying factor for everything: economic growth, social political development. And so all these different actors, the same way you'll interact with them is again, it's exactly what Jonathan said. I will not even try and diminish, try and phrase it any different. It's perfectly just what he said.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I don't see any other questions coming from the audience, and I'm running out of them myself. So we're about 10 minutes before 7. I'm wondering if either of you have anything to add or want to make some closing comments. I've seen a bunch of themes coming through, which is basically don't underestimate the people who you're working with. They can understand what's going on around them, and that you're going to have to make some trade-offs as you move into a conflict situation, but those trade-offs are based on the relationships that you build, which are key to moving your work forward.
Mm.
I might have a couple more things to say. I'm sort of transposing my experience from other social tech fields. I've worked in journalism and poverty and a couple other things, and I think there is, depending on depending on your background, everybody sees a different solution to a problem, right? If you're a technologist, you think the solution is to write an app. If you come from a human rights perspective, you think the solution is awareness or better enforcement of laws or this sort of thing, right? If you're a community organizer, you think the solution has to come from the ground up. The most interesting solutions that I've seen have been when you get across this, right? So rather than asking, what can I do as a community organizer, or what can I do as a technologist, asking, what can I, as a community organizer, do when I work with a technologist? And in many ways, I feel like the peace building world is sort of siloed, right? We even have names for this. We have the track 1, track 2, and sometimes track 3 negotiations. Well, of course, these things interplay, right? And you can get some really interesting effects when you ask how they work together. So, for example, one thing that I've worked in quite a bit is the interplay between corporate sustainability and journalism. So there's a whole corporate sustainability industry. There are consultants that companies hire when they want to, address human rights problems in the supply chain and so forth. But those consultants are constrained because they're paid by the companies. They can't make the companies do anything that they don't want to do, right? They're not there to tell the companies what the right thing to do is. They're there to tell them how to accomplish what they've already decided to do. Whereas journalists have exactly the opposite problem. They can say anything they want. Their job is to represent the voices of the people who are being affected by these problems. But they have no direct influence. They have no insider knowledge and so forth. And so it sounds like each of these is ineffective. But when you put them together in the same ecosystem, you get this really interesting effect where journalism creates something as a problem, right? It makes it unacceptable to have child labor in the supply chain. And then, you know, to the exclusion of journalists, companies work with sustainability consultants who tell them to get the job done. So anyway, my top line there would be to sort of imagine what cooperation across sectors looks like. Even if there's no direct contact, you have to understand how these parts fit together.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add to that is I hope we're not building peace-tech as an industry to just be fixated on conflicts at nexus points of conflict, but as a continuous process so that this thinking can happen outside of a conflict situation. It can help inform how we actually react or respond to conflict or other non-peace situations, if we call them that, in a way that is informed, is responsible, and minimizes harm.
Great. Thank you so much. I think since there's no more questions from the audience and we've been wrapping it up, I think we'll finish a couple minutes early if that's all right with you. Okay. Thank you everyone for tuning into the Build Peace Dialogue series. This was the last one we have scheduled. The next dialogues will take place live at the conference in Zurich. So visit www.howtobuildpeace.org and check out our program and sign up for the conference. We look forward to seeing you. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.